Welcome to the City Rev Life Podcast. I'm Justin, and I am here with Pastor Robey. How you doing, Robey?
Oh, I'm good. How are you doing?
I'm feeling great. Glad to be here, and we're continuing our conversation we started in the last episode. And so to start us off, maybe, Robey, recap a little bit. What did we talk about in the last one, and maybe anything that you would say before we jump into today's content?
Yeah, so we're in a series called Jesus and LGBTQ+, and in this, we're creating, hopefully, a safe place for people that are interested in the dialogue about the historic Christian perspective and the modern LGBTQ perspective. That could be someone that identifies with the LGBTQ+ community. It could be someone that identifies with the historic Christian faith. It could be someone that has loved ones on either side, and they would love to be able to have a dialogue about it. Because in this time, I think we find ourselves, it's hard to have a place to dialogue. So our hope and our goal is that this series is safe. It feels safe. It doesn't feel condemning to anyone on either side. There may be times that someone on one side or the other feels challenged, but hopefully it is a place that is a safe, loving, honest discussion. And so we started in the last, in the episode 1 on just framing up the posture we want to have this conversation, which is loving. And throughout this entire series, we're going to encourage you to stay within the series. We've laid this out in an order. So if you haven't listened to part 1, you're going to want to go back to part 1 and listen to it.
It's a good cue. Maybe even now pause and then go back to part 1 of the series and then jump back in, because like Pastor Robey just shared, we want to have this conversation with love. There's a lot of people having these conversations with snark, with self-righteousness, and we want to be able to handle this with grace and truth. Yes,
absolutely. The other thing, just kind of a housekeeping item, we're using the phrase LGBTQ+, and just really as a shorthand for the ease of conversation. We're acknowledging that there are other initials because there are people that don't identify with just LGBTQ. There's maybe other ways that they identify. And so we're not excluding that. We're just, we acknowledge that there are more initials. It's just that would get cumbersome for conversation. So by LGBTQ or LGBTQ community or LGBTQ+, we're trying to reference much larger community in general in this conversation.
Sweet. So tell us a little bit about this conversation and how we're taking the next step. So we talked about love.
Sure.
Why it's important. You know, we're told in Scripture, if you're got all this truth and no mysteries, but you don't have love, you're useless. So what's today's topic really going to be all about?
Yep. I think it's good. Like you said, Justin, we started with love. And I think, honestly, that should be music to everybody's ears. Now, we appealed to the Bible to get that, but I think that's pretty intuitive for most people. I think most people want to have a conversation in a loving context. So let's actually now start getting into the discussion. There's so many facets. This is a very complex issue, and we're dealing with people's lives, their families, their friends, coworkers. I mean, this is a very sensitive, very complex subject. But as we're walking through this, we're kind of addressing two primary perspectives. There's the LGBTQ community, and the perspectives that come with that community. And then there's the historic Christian perspective and the community that associates with that perspective. And so as we're kind of taking steps into this discussion, I think it'd be helpful for us to go, that's very complex. Let's go to, there's one really foundational point where that's actually pretty simple, where these two perspectives, there's a fork in the road. Right. Yeah, that's a good way of putting it. There's a fork in the road that I think is way deeper than most people are having the conversation.
Right.
But I think if we look at this point where the two paths diverge, I think it's actually really helpful, and it's helpful for us to be able to empathize with the other person's perspective and actually hear them differently. Otherwise, it just feels like the historic Christian perspective versus the LGBTQ perspective. It's like there's two different conversations happening.
Right.
And it can feel like both sides can feel like I cannot understand how you come to the conclusion that you're coming to.
Right.
And so it doesn't create really a safe, loving environment to have that kind of conversation.
That's good. And one of the things that I've heard that's helpful whenever you're having conversations with someone who has a different viewpoint than you always want to be able to describe their position in a way that when you put it, they would hear it and agree with you and say, yeah,
Sure.
that's where I'm coming from. And so what we're trying to do is get to the root of, okay, where are these perspectives diverging? Let's start there rather than talking past each other, further down the road.
Yes.
And so where would you say that fork really begins?
So my perspective on this, obviously this is not the final word, but
Sure.
This is where, just from my vantage point, I know you and I have talked a lot about this, Justin, I think you'd agree. I think the foundational question, you're going down the road and there's a fork, is this question: where do you find truth? Mm-hmm. Where is the source of truth? And there are two different takes on this. The one perspective on that is, and this would be the majority of the historical perspective on this, would be that truth is found externally, and then I conform myself to that external truth. That could be a number of different things for people. They could be the Holy Scriptures from a particular religion. It could be science. It could be any number of external sources that they would say, this is the ultimate source of truth. I conform my perspective, my beliefs, my thinking to that external source of truth. The other perspective, and this would be far more, I think, popular in operation today,
right,
is the idea that truth is not it's not found in an external location, it's found inside of me.
Right.
So where I go to formulate my truth is I look down inside of my heart. So we say this in like very kind of popular level, we'd say like, believe in yourself, trust yourself, follow your heart, look to your heart. We'd say like those things, but that is actually a much deeper, it's not just a Hallmark card. That's a much deeper held idea, where the way how I find my way forward is through self-discovery. So when I look inside, I need to stay true to myself. And whereas in a historical perspective with an externally located truth, heresy would be defined as going against that particular external source.
Right.
If there's an internal source of truth is found within, then heresy is not being true to myself.
Right. And heresy being the ultimate form of going against what's right.
Yes. Heresy.
Diverging
from what's right. Like the worst thing you could do is, if there's an external source of truth, the worst thing you could do is violate whatever that external truth says.
Right.
If truth is internal, the worst thing you could do is violate what's inside.
Right. And so then the opposite is true, right? So if that's heresy, then what's noble or what's virtuous in the one sense is to submit or conform to the external truth. And then what's noble and courageous on the other side is to live out what's inside.
Absolutely. Right. So then that informs this particular conversation.
Right. And why I think this is so helpful is going back to our first conversation on love, where we left off and we kind of teased it out but didn't really talk much about it. There's a section in 1 Corinthians 13 that says love rejoices in the truth.
Yes.
And then the question is, well, how do you define truth?
Yes.
And so that's where we're saying that where there's a divergent path, the fork in the road happens with one group having this conversation says there's an external source of truth.
Yes.
The other group is saying, no, what's true is found on the inside.
Right. And that's a really good point, because I think this is a place where there can be empathy on both sides, because, love doesn't leave truth out. Like if I have a friend who's in a very abusive, destructive relationship, and I see that, it's not loving for me to ignore that. And in fact, it would be most loving for me to risk the friendship to bring truth to them, to save them. If someone's abusing a substance and they're destroying their lives, like I would risk it's loving to risk the friendship to gently, humbly, graciously bring truth to them. So like love will include truth. So there are some in the LGBTQ community that will say the most loving thing you could do is help someone be true to the truth inside of them.
Right.
And there are some from the those who would be the historic biblical Christian perspective would say the most loving thing you could do is graciously, gently hold them to an external truth.
Right. And so you could just see how talking past each other would happen.
And it's helpful to appreciate those two different perspectives.
Right. Yeah. And so that's where we wanted to begin this conversation.
Yes.
Talking about that. So break this down a little more about how those differences play out in a society. If you live those out, what are the differences, or how would you talk us through it?
Yeah. So let's first of all, how it's playing out right now in this discussion about LGBTQ as a community and all of the discussion surrounding that. That's why gender then has within that community, and sexuality has so many different associations, because someone would look inside and to find that truth. Whereas there would be those in that would look to the Bible or another source for ultimate truth and say, well, this defines gender, this defines identity, this defines sexuality. And so this is where this divergence is, all the way at that fork in the road. So then let's play our cards some and walk through that.
Sure.
So obviously, maybe not obviously, but this is a church podcast. We are very clear as a church that we look to the Bible. So we would operate from the side that says that there is an external source of truth. Mm-hmm. But I want to just maybe walk out why. Like, why would we take that perspective on it? And I think that might be helpful. So 3 reasons outside of, we look to the Bible as the external truth. That's the one that we would look to as a church. The Bible claims that, but let's for a second not appeal to the Bible as an external truth and what it says. Let's just talk about more in generally, why would we appeal to an external truth rather than an internal truth? So let's just start there. 3 reasons. The first one is pure logic. So if we appeal to an internal source of truth, if we say, look, the way you're going to find truth is you look inside. Each person needs to look inside to find an internal truth. That's where ultimate truth is. There's a logical challenge with that, in that it's not truly that's not truly consistently lived out, or very rarely is. For example, to live that out, we would have to really dismiss basically the scientific method. Like, science is built on the idea of an external source of truth, because what science as an experimentation is I start with a hypothesis. That's what I'm thinking inside is probably true. And then I'm testing it because I'm trying to find out an external source of truth. I'm trying to find truth, which is external. It's outside of my head and my mind. I'm trying to test my thoughts to conform it to nature. So I test it. I'm trying to find the laws of nature as an external source of truth. And as I'm testing those things, good science then corrects the hypotheses that I had that were wrong. Bad science would then either tweak the experiment to just affirm my hypothesis, or ignore something that disagrees with me.
Right.
So to live purely by a internal truth, most of us don't live like that. There are some facets of reality that we embrace and we accept in various areas of our life.
Yes. So and even the idea of truth, to even use a different term, is realities, things that are the way they are. I remember an experiment we did in elementary school where we were taught, we had an apple and like a basketball, and asked the question, which do you think will land first? And everybody in the classroom got it wrong. They thought, I think that the apple would land first because it was lighter or whatever. And then you see them land at the same time. So our hypothesis was wrong. Gravity is right.
Sure. Yeah.
And so we adjust that. So the scientific method presumes that there are fixed realities about the universe, about the world, about biology. There are fixed realities, and we have a hypothesis, and we conform that to the hypothesis based on what we see.
Now, if you're listening and you would operate, no, I think that truth is found in eternal truth, please don't hear this as an attack, just a discussion and just something to consider. That's a hard way to live consistently in life. Secondly, though, I think it's not hard to see how that is not sustainable for a society. So if everyone is living according to an internal truth, that has actually been a historic definition of anarchy. So like there's historic documents that said, everyone living in a way that seemed true to themselves. And as not a positive, it can be anarchy. Why? Because if someone sees a particular crime, like treason, assassination, a hate crime, some oppression, if that seems right to them, society needs to hold those things accountable. And so what we're doing is we're saying, here is the law, we're holding you accountable to that. To live in a pure truth is whatever you found on the inside, and that's okay. To live that out purely, that society could not stand. And so what we have really in our society that is very scientific, we have a lot of technology, a lot of modern medicine, we have laws, like there's a lot of external truth we live in. We just, in certain subjects, we then appeal to an internal truth, which is maybe not consistent, which I would argue would not be consistent.
Right.
So the second one would be it's hard for a society to be sustainable with a view of an inside truth.
Yeah. So that factor of consistency, to apply that consistently personally, and then to apply that consistently societally, to just be operating from an look inside version of truth.
Right.
It doesn't lead to flourishing, to a place where there's mutual respect and justice and those kinds of important things that we value.
Right. Those two categories of both just kind of logic and also society, most of us are very comfortable living in an external type of truth. The question then is, but when it comes to things that are around my personal identity, isn't it okay to kind of go with an internal truth around the things that are like personal to me, like gender, sexuality, identity? Like, isn't it okay? Like, why would I then need to appeal to an external source for issues of identity? And I actually think this would be the third point. I actually think that found in the right source, actually identity is best expressed when bolstered by an external truth. And here's why. Because we can't purely live out our identity with an internal based truth and live a completely healthy life. Because every one of us has brokenness inside that we need external truth to help heal and sometimes correct. So for example, if someone looked inside and what they found was racism, bigotry, chauvinism, we would not say, hey, be true to yourself. Like if that's what you find on the inside, then go with that. And to diverge from that would be heretical. No, we'd say, hey, that's not healthy. Those things are hateful, they're oppressive, they're hurtful, and like those need to be cleaned up in your life, or you're going to have a lot of broken relationships and you're going to break and hurt a lot of people. Like those are not healthy things to leave inside of you. And that's to not even address other things like arrogance or narcissism or bitterness or any other number of things. I mean, when we look inside, even for our most personal things, our identities are so fickle. They're turbulent waters. There's hurt that we need to find healing from. And so to find healing, we can't find, I don't believe the best place to find that healing is to just push deeper inside, because there's biases and prejudices that probably each one of us need to look inside, and we need an external truth to correct and to find healing in there. And so even in the areas of the the sacred waters of the very personal things and very like things like identity, like even there, the right external truth can be very life-giving and healing.
Yeah, that's great to think in that category of, if what's on the inside you're looking, and all of it, we're imperfect people.
Sure.
I mean, if we're honest, every single human has thoughts that they're embarrassed by, that if somebody found out. And we wouldn't say, hey, that's your truth to live out.
Right.
Societally, we would make claims like, hey, that is not good. And by making that statement, we are appealing to some sort of external truth. So I think what you're drawing out is the consistency.
Sure.
It's difficult to apply that consistently. So summarize those 3 points again, just to wrap up. You said it was 3 things.
Sure.
That this divergence, this fork in the road takes
Sure.
place.
And let me also just say, like, this is not trying to convince anybody or to change someone's thoughts necessarily. This is just to create some dialogue. I think the main first divergence that makes this conversation at sometimes feel like people are just miles apart is that some would look at, and this is very common, that truth is ultimately found on the inside, and others would say truth is ultimately found externally. We're just laying out 3 reasons why we think the external truth is, and we haven't necessarily even made a case for the Bible as that external truth. We're not even really there yet. We're mainly just saying, why would an external truth be a more consistent and potentially healthy way to live ultimately if you find the right external truth? That could be devastating if you find the wrong one.
Sure.
But the 3 reasons would be, again, like just logically and consistently living life with things like science and technology. There's so many things like the laws of nature, like those don't come from the inside. Maps, finding how to, GPS. I mean, we're appealing to truths outside of ourselves. Also, just societally, I don't think anyone would want to live in a world that anyone can do whatever they want and to be true to themselves. But thirdly, like even in the deep sacred ground of my personhood and my identity, there are things in there that if we just, that every one of us needs to find healing in, so that we're to fully live and to fully express a thriving life. And to do that, the right, healthy external truth that can bring someone to really thrive, I think is the best way to go, because otherwise there's brokenness in each one of us that we're not addressing.
Sure. And so any teasing you can do for where we're going next in our conversation?
So this leaves it with not saying which is the right external truth. And in the next episode, let's talk about the Bible, because there's times that the Bible has been used very oppressively. I mean, the Bible has been used in a way that's hateful. The Bible has been used in ways that is really confining to people. So let's talk about that. Let's talk about the Bible. Let's talk about it as a potential external truth to look to, and let's see what it speaks to on this issue and see, is that life-giving or not?
Yeah. Well, we hope that this conversation, as we've continued talking about love and then talking about truth, where do we find it, has helped create some dialogue. And so if there's someone that that would benefit from sharing this conversation, would love for you to share it with them, let them know. And for that, we will see you on the next episode of the City Rev Life Podcast.
Thank you so much for listening to the City Rev Life Podcast. Feel free to subscribe or leave a rate and review. If you want more content or additional resources, head to cityrev.org or download our app. We hope you have a great day.